You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. You're listening to us on CBS Radio WJFK 1580 AM or visiting us at WMClive.com for this and for any of our previous episodes. Look for WMC Live on Facebook and Twitter, and you can now stream, download, and subscribe to our show's podcast worldwide at iTunes. This week's guests are a powerhouse of women, an artist unearthing ancestral cultural history, a doctor taking the fight for reproductive rights to an entirely new level, and a survivor of prostitution changing the laws country after country to save women's lives. But first we need to look inside the headlines. The headlines this past week have, of course, been honoring the life of Nelson Mandela. I thought we might spend a few moments inside the headlines honoring the lives of the women of Nelson Mandela. There were 3 wives. Let's look at them. The first was a nurse whom he married when he was a young lawyer in Soweto. Her name was Evelyn Ntoko Masay, and they had 4 kids, including a little girl who died at 9 months. But his politics, even then, kept him away from his family. He was virtually never home, and his absence apparently drove her to religion. One could say in the worst way, she became involved with Jehovah's Witnesses. In any event, the marriage ended with abruptness when one day he said, as she testified in a documentary film, "Evelyn, I feel I have no love for you anymore. I'll give you the children and the house." And that was it. He was out of there. Soon afterwards, however, he met a young firebrand, a medical social worker who was 16 years younger than him and very political. Her name was Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela, and he was taken with her. They married in 1958 while he was already in a marathon trial on treason charges. They did have 2 daughters who are alive today, and they stayed married for a long time, although it was a soap opera of politics, quarrels, passion, a lot of drama. While he was in prison, Winnie Mandela, as she became known, in no small part launched and in very large part sustained a national campaign of civil disobedience to free him. That, of course, became an international campaign eventually. For most of their marriage, she visited him and saw him only through the thick glass of the prison visiting room. She cooked and brought his favorite food. She brought him books. For 21 years, she could never touch him. But she was his voice to the outside world. She was his source of information about friends and comrades in politics. She interpreted his views to the journalists who came to visit her. Because she became so known and because she was his voice, the police tormented her. They jailed her frequently. They finally banished her and her children to a remote Afrikaner town, Brandford. Imagine that. Her house was burned down, and she was spotted standing outside just staring at the embers. And in a section of a poem called Arbitrary Bread, I wrote these lines about her. Winnie Mandela stands outside the smoking timbers of what yesterday was her home. She stares. She does not enter. Lost articles, inanimate, speechless things flare to mind, each vivid, crisped with grief. The books, the diaries, the humble gifts from ordinary people, the wedding pictures, the letters, 30 years of them from him in prison. while she raised the children, carried messages, was banned, was under house arrest, in jail and out, while she made visits to him, made speeches, made an example of herself, was made his symbol, was made a metaphor for freedom. Men manage to make their revolutions from abstraction, but no slogans can be made from the thoughts of a woman sifting the ashes of her life. The last bed in which they ever slept together. Gone now. The baby pictures, the headscarf her mother left her, the recipes, the saved invitations to far countries she could not go, the mirror she aged in. Well, by the time she was finally permitted by the government back into Soweto in 1984, I think she had gone a little mad. She had become very militant, as indeed Mandela had been when they met. She now dressed in military garb. She surrounded herself with young men who terrorized and kidnapped people whom she deemed hostile to Mandela or to the cause. She became implicated in the kidnapping and murder of young township activists. But Mandela refused to criticize her, and when he was released and became president, her popularity was as great as his, so much so that he appointed her Deputy Minister of Arts. Tragically, I think because she went a little mad. The position became an entangled one for her in financial scandals, and she increasingly and publicly challenged him for appeasing whites, which in private, I might add, he said he was doing because white flight is something that the country couldn't afford. It would take all the money with. Well, finally, in 1995, he filed for divorce. It was a public hearing and very humiliating to her. Mandela later fell in love with and married the very graceful Graça Machel, who herself was the widow of the former president of Mozambique, and a feminist, acknowledged, used the word, activist and human rights activist in her own right. They married when he was 80 years old on his birthday, and she survives him. So those are the three women behind the great man, and indeed, as we measure the cost he paid in all those years of enduring prison and humiliation, we might measure just for a moment the cost they paid, perhaps especially Winnie. But in any event, all three, they paid. They paid. We need to take a short pause here. This is Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan, and when we return, we'll be speaking with a multimedia artist who has unearthed some fascinating, multifaceted Chinese-American herstory.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
And we're back. Lenora Lee is a dancer and choreographer who is an artistic resident at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. She uses martial arts, text, and video in her work as well as dance. And the pieces we discuss were presented at the Young Museum through their Artist Fellows program, November 8th and 9th. Welcome, Lenora. Welcome to Women's Media Center Live.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for getting up super early in the morning on the West Coast to do this taping. This sounds like an extraordinary project that you as a dancer and choreographer and multimedia artist have concocted. You use martial arts, text, and video as well as dance, and it's called The Escape and Rescued Memories, New York Stories, companion dance and multimedia pieces inspired by the stories of Chinese women immigrants to the United States in the early 20th century. Tell how did you come to deal with this, with the human trafficking of Chinese women as a work of art?
Well, I actually grew up in San Francisco, and my parents did as well, deep in the heart of Chinatown. And so we were familiar with Donaldina Cameron House and its beginnings back in 1874. We were familiar with its history, and back in that time, there were Presbyterian missionaries who were doing work in this Chinatown area, and one of their missions was to assist women and children who had been caught in very difficult situations, and to be able to provide various services for them. So at that time, they were providing English classes, job skills training, and also it was an actual safe haven, or they provided housing and lodging for those who needed it. As I dug deeper in my research last year, at that period of time last year, there were previous staff members who were doing archival work, and
this is at the Donaldina Cameron House.
Yeah, correct.
Which was the refuge for these women.
The refuge, yes. So they actually kept very detailed records of all the women and children they were brought over, because there was such a lack of women and females and family members over here. Most of the Chinese that immigrated in the mid to late 1800s were male laborers. Mm-hmm. There became this lucrative underground business of bringing women and young girls and children over to serve, to be servants. Some were unfortunately forced into prostitution. Mm-hmm. Now, they had oftentimes been tricked back at home, believing that they were being brought over to, meet wonderful people.
Right. Still goes on today. So this was both, Chinese women were imported, both for sexual trafficking and labor trafficking.
Correct.
Wow. And with a few, obviously some did manage to escape, because you're titling part of the presentation "The Escape." Right. Those are the ones who made it to the Donaldina?
Yes. And I believe there was also a Methodist church close by. And so at that time, there was just, various missionaries throughout the country, I think, who were doing this type of work. Now, the thing about Donaldina Cameron, who the organization is now named after, was that there's quite a bit of documentation on her, and that she did certain rescue missions and would go across the country when she got word of women being in trouble. Mm-hmm. So that was part of it, but also what I wanted to focus the piece on as well was that there were within the community, women who would try to find safe passage for people they knew. They would help each other out.
Of course.
Right. So it was also about the strength of the community and being able to escape these types of situations, and then being those on the forefront of building the Chinese community that we have today. And so it's just these particular stories about what the women actually went through aren't very well known. There's documentation of the missionary work. However, I wanted to go into the archives and actually see what the testimony of these women were, because so the missionaries would try to fight in the courts for custody of these women, and so the women would have to document, how they came over, mm-hmm. where they stayed, who purchased them, how many times they were sold,
wow.
what they had to do. So it was really intense. And, there was a certain amount of information that I could gather through the archival records. However, there was a lot that I really needed to understand from an emotional, experiential perspective, which is why I decided to do research at the Asian Women's Shelter and Asian Pacific Islands Legal Outreach.
How wise, because what interests me especially about this, well, first of all, that you're doing it at all, and what you've unearthed here, but especially about this piece is not so much the work that all the missionaries did, with all due respect to the missionaries, and I'm sure some of them were terrific women and they did amazing work, but missionaries in general are not my favorite people because they usually exact a price for the rescue or the shelter, and that's do it my way, with my religion or my set of values or my Western whatever. So what I find especially interesting about this is the research that you managed to do about the community helping itself and women who had escaped turning back and helping other women. That just seems to me brain-blowingly courageous, and I'm sure that's where the emotional wallop, and the fact that you as an artist dare go there, that's where the emotional wallop really lies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, it was pretty incredible doing the research on the current day situation, and as I had just mentioned, those two organizations, the Asian Women's Shelter and Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach.
Yes.
Advocates there were very generous in providing a lot of various stories and situations in which women had to face a variety and host of experiences and challenges, and actually what they have to go through in order to allow these internationally trafficked women to stay and to provide services for them. And so it was just an incredible amount of information, and I still feel like I'm just kind of scratching the surface at the beginning.
Where can people see this? And also, is there a website that they can go to so they can keep on track of where it will be playing?
Sure. My website is LenoraLeeDance.com, so LenoraLee dance.com. Mm-hmm. And we are going to premiere the pieces in New York on May 8th and 9th at the Asia Society. I did want to mention briefly that the new New York Stories piece was inspired by a woman who was brought over and was forced into indentured servitude for 2 years, and then she ended up escaping. And I did research with advocates at the New York Asian Women's Center and had the Asian Pacific American Institute at New York University was instrumental in providing various contacts who understand the history of New York Chinatown, who have generations of family and ancestry there. And so the research that I've been able to do in New York has been really incredible and very much well supported by both community and nonprofit organizations. And so it's really been a blessing to be able to do research on both coasts in regards to subject matter.
Thank you for doing this work, and thank you for being with us on Women's Media Center Live.
Thank you so much.
And it's time to practice a little verbal karate. This entry is from Unspinning the Spin, How to Decode the Hype and Say What You Really Mean, the Women's Media Center Guide to Fair and Accurate Language. It'll be the first book from the Women's Media Center, published by WMC Press, written by the great Rosalie Maggio, the word maven, with a preface by Gloria Steinem and myself, and it will be out next year. This entry is The Pledge of Allegiance. When the owners of the popular children's magazine Youth's Companions were selling flags to schools, they asked Christian socialist author and Baptist minister Francis Bellamy to write something for their advertising campaign. The result was the Pledge of Allegiance, which was first used in public schools in 1892. It did not have the phrase "under God" in it. On Flag Day in 1943, the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional, violating the First Amendment, to oblige schoolchildren to recite the pledge and salute the flag. In 1951, the Knights of Columbus began a campaign to get Congress to add the words "under God" to the pledge. Their attempts failed until one of them personally convinced President Eisenhower of the need for it. The change was passed by Congress in 1954. The founders thought they had covered all bases in their efforts to maintain separation of church and state. Judging by their own words, not one of them would have thought adding "under God" was a good idea. It's time for another quick break. I'm Robin Morgan, and this is Women's Media Center Live. And when we come back, I'll talk with a doctor who has repositioned both birth and abortion to remind us that it's really all about the woman.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
Welcome back. Our next guest, Dr. Katharine Morrison, is an OB/GYN who worked for quite a while at the Buffalo Abortion Clinic, whose chief, Dr. Sepian, was murdered. She took a break then, but she came back, and when she did so, she came back with a plan that has thrown the anti-abortion forces into total disarray and confusion, and is a very empowering thing for women. Katharine, welcome to Women's Media Center Live.
Thank you so much.
You are creating a new model for women's health, and by having birthing centers combined with abortion clinics as a full service facility for women's reproductive freedom for whatever she chooses. Tell how you got into this. How did you get this brilliant idea?
Well, thank you for calling it brilliant. Since other people call it perverse, but I started working in abortion services in 1998. I had been a sort of a standard OB/GYN for 10 years, and then I joined Buffalo Women's Services. And just a couple of months after I joined, Dr. Slepian was murdered. Yes. And I quit for a very brief period of time and then went back to it. And then and I occasionally did some work in the hospital, and it occurred to me that women were treated better in our abortion facility than they were on labor and delivery. And then in 2007, I reconnected with a home birth midwife and a group of women who were trying to start a freestanding birth center, which Buffalo had many families had tried this since the late 70s, and they had never been able to get it off the ground because there are very stringent regulations in New York State. And I was at this meeting, and they were talking, and it occurred to me that I had actually never seen a natural birth, although I'd been in OB/GYN for close to 20 years at that point.
How interesting.
Yes, and so I said to the midwife, could I come out to a couple of home births with you? And she said yes, thinking that of course I would not be able to take it because I was hospital trained. And at the very first birth, I was just blown away because I saw that the woman was in charge, and that it was a beautiful experience. It was very empowering for the woman. The midwife was just there to help her. She wasn't the most important person in the room. And I noticed that when I was at a birth, I was the most important person.
Of course.
And I realized how profoundly woman-centered this sort of work was. And so I became her collaborating OB, which at that point the laws mandated that every midwife had to have a collaborating obstetrician.
Right.
And then one thing led to another, and I also saw another connection with abortion was how angry the choice for home birth or natural birth made everyone. They just demonized the woman and her family, thinking that they were ignorant and
but it's because she's seizing power over her own reproductive existence in another way, and that seems to be incredibly threatening.
Exactly.
How they can still take that position in a society where, as a major country in the world, the superpower, we have an increasing maternal mortality rate, which is appalling. It's doubled, hasn't it?
Yes.
And that's just shocking.
Right. So in 1987, there were less than 7 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. And in 2005, there were over 13.
God.
So a doubling in less than 20 years.
And they don't think they're doing something wrong?
Not at all. Not at all. And they're not concerned that the C-section rate has gone from 5% in 1970 to 40% in 2013.
Wow.
They're not concerned. They're not concerned about any of it, and no one is concerned. I've spoken to heads of OB departments and heads of nursing departments and the CEOs of insurance companies, and everybody will pat me on the head and say, "Oh yes, it's just dreadful, but there's nothing we can do about it." And so I thought again about the freestanding birth center, because not every woman can choose a home birth,
right,
either for economic reasons or because it seems too out there. But a birth center has the feeling that you're in an institution, the same as a hospital. And the midwife I work with pointed out that people in the United States have this idea that you go somewhere to have a baby. So going to a birth center is acceptable. The thing that has kept birth centers from being started in New York State is the necessity of the certificate of need. And I looked around and I said, well, at that point I owned Buffalo Women's Services. And I said, well, I have a certificate of need, and my certificate of need says abortion services and family planning. So let's see if we can extend it. And I petitioned the Department of Health. It took 4 years, and there was always another hurdle, and then we got the approval.
What is the date when you open?
December 14th.
Of 2013. That is historic. Tell me, Katharine, since abortion provider facilities, you have CONs, have certificates of need. This idea could spread, could it not, elsewhere in the state or even in the country?
Well, I was hoping that it would. So I actually submitted a paper to the National Abortion Federation. I was hoping to present this idea because New York State has these very restrictive laws, and that's why we're only the second freestanding freestanding birth center in New York State. There have been others that opened, but they closed, or they weren't able to even open.
I see.
And so I was trying to get the National Abortion Federation to let me, of which organization I'm a member, to let me present this paper. It seemed too far out there for them, but I'm hoping that with some publicity, people will think more on it. And I think it's a natural fit, because abortion providers are there because they feel that women are the best suited to make decisions about their own bodies.
Of course.
And so people who believe in natural childbirth also believe that women are best suited to make those decisions.
Well, I tell you what, one of the things that I love about it is that it totally reframes both issues. If you're a right-wing fanatic, religious fundamentalist or whatever, out there picketing and calling us all baby killers, you have a hard time when, in fact, babies are being born inside as well. It changes it changes the focus from aborting an unwanted pregnancy or even giving birth to a wanted pregnancy. It changes both focuses to the woman, to what does this woman want?
Right, because really, unless we have all of these rights, the right to decide whether to have sex, the right to decide with whom to have sex.
That's right.
The right to decide whether or not to get pregnant, the right to decide whether or not to continue the pregnancy, and then the right to decide how to give birth and to have our bodies and our uteruses respected and our wishes respected. Unless we have all of those rights, then we don't have true reproductive freedom.
And if we don't have reproductive freedom, all of the other rights go down the tube. They really do, because if you can't control your own, if you don't have control over your own body that you inhabit, equal pay, all of the rest of it is secondary.
Right.
So this is a basic human right, and to bring these things together as services for women is not only a wonderful practical service, but what it does to repositioning both issues in the minds of people, I think, is wonderful. It's probably one reason why there is, and I use the word advisedly, hysteria in the far right about this.
And I also want to point out that there are other parallels because, for example, right now in Buffalo, New York, although we have two hospital systems, the Catholic and a secular hospital system, there's no hospital that I can bring a patient to have an abortion. And there's also no hospital where a woman can get natural childbirth unless she has a provider who will fight for her. All of the protocols in the hospitals are designed are unscientific, the continuous fetal monitor, all of these inductions, the C-section rate, all of these are designed for the convenience of the provider, the physician,
and they cost more.
They cost more, and they hurt women, and they hurt babies.
Tell me, is there a website where people can check out your center?
Oh, I would love it if they did. I have a Facebook page, which is the best way, and it's called the Birthing Center of Buffalo.
Okay, Birthing Center of Buffalo. And we've been talking with Dr. Katharine Morrison, and I congratulate you and wish you all the possible best luck on a courageous and really useful, great service to women.
Robin, thank you so much.
We have to take another short break here. This is Women's Media Center Live, and I am still Robin Morgan. We'll be back in just a moment with an interview all the way from Ireland, which I assure you will not want to miss.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio.
Welcome back again. When you're 15 years old and destitute, too unskilled to work, too young to claim unemployment, the only thing you have to sell is your body. My next guest, Rachel Moran, on the phone from Dublin, survived that reality, lived to tell about it, to write about it, to become an activist about it, to form a group that combats it. You can find them at spaceinternational.us, and to be with us today, telling a story you will not forget. Rachel, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Robin.
This is an unforgettable book that you've written called Paid For, My Journey Through Prostitution. And the searing honesty of it, it's very well written, I might add as well. It's so far, it's only published in the UK and in Ireland, but I'm going to do my damnedest to see that it gets published here. But people can probably access it online, buy it online. It was published by Gill, Gill, and Macmillan Books. So check it out, listeners. Rachel, tell the story of how this book came to be and how the wonderful you came to be, because it's...
Well, I don't know about the wonderful me, Robin, but the book came to be simply because after having spent 7 years in prostitution between the ages of 15 and 22, I simply had to make sense of that experience, and being a writer, that was the way, that was the mechanism of it that came naturally to me.
But other books have talked about the institution of prostitution, and some have even been sort of memoirs. But yours is the first book to actually let the reader in on what happens. What actually happens when you're alone in the room and there's the John and the door closes? And it's something that once read is never forgotten. So talk about those years and how you managed to get yourself liberated from that.
The process of liberating yourself from prostitution, I think, is something that it's an ongoing process, and it will continue, I think, in every woman's life who's lived it until the day that she dies. There's no such thing as walking out of a brothel and moving on as though you'd never had that string of experiences, because they live inside you, if you know what I mean.
Of course.
It's. I remember, and I used a beautiful quote from a woman in my book, who had said that the damage was inerasable, and I remember she finished up saying, "My body remembers all of it," and that's something that I can so identify with. But for me, I was very lucky. I was one of the lucky ones, in that I got out of prostitution without any long-term, physical health damage. I've known women who got involved in heroin and they ended up with, all sorts of Hep C, HIV, all of this kind of irreversible problems. So I was lucky. I was very lucky in that sense. Although I had been, I was an absolute rampaging cocaine addict and did severe damage to my septum, but that's not it's not something that's going to cause me the type of problems I've seen in other women's lives.
Yes.
But what I had to do basically with that book was I just had to tell the truth. Now, I read your book, Saturday's Child, a few years ago. I actually sent off to America for it.
Really?
Yeah. And one of the several things that, the way when you read a book, certain things will just stick in your mind and come back to you.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stayed with me from Saturday's Child was a woman that you'd spoken to many years ago who had said to you about the unionization of prostitution. She said, "This is not work that should be unionized. This is work that should not exist."
Yes.
And I remember at that time I was in the last years of writing my own book, and it took me 11 years to write it from start to finish.
Wow.
And because it was so painful, it was something I came and went from. I didn't tip away at it every evening kind of thing. But I remember reading those lines in your book with such a sense of relief, because I thought to myself, oh, thank God, women have been saying these things and have been recorded as having said these things for years before I sat down to write my book.
Yes.
So that was a relief, yeah.
Well, I'm honored to have been any conveyor of her wisdom to you, that woman, a long time ago. I remember her very well. You have become an activist as well, because you co-founded SPACE, which, tell me if I'm wrong, stands for Survivors of Prostitution Abuse Calling for Enlightenment, yes?
Yes, that's right. And we always make it our business to hyphenate those two words, prostitution, abuse.
Yes.
Because it is a form of abuse that very often people, they think that somehow the money does away with the abusive element. It doesn't. All it does is compounds the abuse, because it adds a sense of culpability. Prostitution is something that a lot of people have a really difficult time understanding, and you have to have a bit of leeway with that, I find, in the activism that I'm doing. You have to be prepared to explain to people, because I know that there is no way I could have understood prostitution fully and thoroughly in the way that I do without having lived it.
Of course, of course.
But at the same time, Robin, I do believe that we all have an instinctual sense of it as being wrong.
Well, you never, with all the folks who have become popularized because of financing by the sex industry, who talk about how it's a groovy occupation and use the phrase sex work and so forth. This is the, quote, victimless crime, unquote. Well, we know it has a higher rate of PTSD than frontline combat for soldiers in battle. I do not understand how these myths can be perpetuated. I mean, I do, but I don't, if you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean, and it's intensely frustrating for me. I've just come back from, where we've been travelling fairly relentlessly now the last few months. But I've just come back from Scotland, and where we had been speaking to politicians and frontline service providers and different people over there. And the funny thing is, when we spoke to the service providers, not one out of about 25 people contradicted a word we had to say, because they deal with women day in, day out, and young men who are living this issue. But then when you go along and you speak to other people, you have these, but maybe it's not so bad, or maybe some other women have different opinions, and maybe not everybody sees it as you see it. And this is what you come up against. And like you say, it is perpetuated and deliberately perpetuated by certain people and groups. And it's very frustrating, because at the same time that you're having these conversations, and particularly with women, Robin, it always annoys me with female academics in particular.
I know.
I've got to tell you, I have a special sort of contempt for female academics who try to tell me that prostitution is suitable work for other women, when they would never, in a moment's nightmare, choose that for themselves.
Well, anytime people abstractify something, and it's so convenient, because they're not forced to face the concretion of the reality, much less in their own lives. So it's very convenient to say, "Oh, it's good for you, go off and do it," in some abstract way. But it is absolutely infuriating, and it's intellectually dishonest. And they are people who, above all, should be intellectually honest as academics.
Absolutely, and this is why it's so bizarre. We've one particular female academic here in Ireland who's always talking about social justice and how we should deal with prostitution in a manner that reflects social justice. And then she'll turn around and tell you that we ought to be legalising and decriminalising. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is just blatantly false. What she's saying is just so blatantly dishonest. There is no social justice in trying to legalise something harmful.
Well, when somebody is being bought and sold, that if that's not a human rights issue, I don't know what is. And of course, more women are sexually trafficked and sexually enslaved in prostitution today. In other words, if you look at it in terms of sexual slavery, which it is, there are more slaves in that respect, enslaved women, enslaved people, than there were in the United States South before the Civil War. And yet, this is not a global issue of outrage. I mean, the women's movement's been on it for some time, but and now we have some actual governments, some states, like some of the Nordic countries, who are beginning to come on board with criminalizing the Johns, as well as the pimps and brothel owners, but not the women. But it's amazing to me the contortions that people go through on this issue, people who claim morality.
I know. But what is so incredibly heartening to us here is that the Nordic model, well, it's going to need a name change soon, because it's begun to shift down from the Nordic countries, and it's on the move now throughout Western Europe. We had a 15-member committee vote unanimously here in June that Ireland should adopt the Nordic model.
Really? Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was after 3.5 years of relentless campaigning from sex trade survivors and their allies. We had Lord Morrow in Northern Ireland. We've been up there twice now to support him. He's floated his own bill, following the principles of the Nordic model. And France, the best news we've had in a long time, has just voted for it.
Yes, I heard that.
So the reality is that the Nordic model is on the move. It is spreading. We have a vicious kickback from the sex trade profiteers, of course. We always knew we would.
Yep.
But I really do passionately believe that we're going to win this fight.
Oh, I do too. I thank you, Rachel, for everything you do and who you are, and I hope to meet you someday.
Thanks a million. That would be lovely, Robin.
And now it's time for Fighting Words. What if a major United Nations program was urging all UN nation states to promote prostitution? Wouldn't you think that would be a front-page story? Have you read or seen this story covered anywhere? No? How can that be? Sorry, a necessary digression here for a bit of background. As you probably know, the current global women's movement has for at least 40 years been fighting pimps, brothel owners, traffickers, and the selling and buying of human beings, which has another name, slavery. For decades, feminists, some of them survivors themselves, have also been pointing out that prostitution devalues all women, so is an issue concerning all women. For decades, such feminists as Kathleen Barry and the late Andrea Dworkin called for the strategy of 1. Criminalizing the buyers while decriminalizing the women they buy, the victims in this so-called victimless crime. 2. Offering support services to the women, ranging from safe harbor through drug rehabilitation to education and skills training. 3. Enforcing laws that criminalize pimps, traffickers, and brothel owners. The response was that it would never work, and feminists were crazy. There's been sustained backlash during these decades, of course. The sex industry fought back openly, with oldest profession always been with us and sexual liberation arguments, and covertly, through funding of happy hooker-type groups reframing prostitution as, quote, sex work, and praising it as a career choice like any other. You ever encountered an 8-year-old little girl saying, "Ooh, I want to grow up to be prostituted"? Post-traumatic stress is found in 20 to 30% of combat veterans, but in 2/3 of prostituted women. Vednita Carter, a survivor activist, has pointed out that every prostituted/trafficked woman has been forced, whether or not she seems to choose willingly. Racism, violence, and poverty loom as ever-present forms of coercion in the sex industry. Here is Carter writing in Sisterhood is Forever on the demographics of prostitution. The average age of entry in prostitution in the U.S. is 14. 75% of women in prostitution are survivors of child molestation, child rape, and/or child sexual or physical abuse. 60 to 75% of those women were sexually abused before age 18. 95% suffer from drug and/or alcohol addiction. 80% are victims of rape 8 to 10 times every year. 66% are victims of physical and/or sexual abuse by pimp boyfriends. 55% are victims of kidnapping. 83% are victims of assault with a weapon. Now, every one of these factors has an even greater impact on women of color. African American women, 7% of the U.S. population, nonetheless comprise more than 50% of women abused in prostitution. And we are only now discovering the enormity of impact that prostitution has on the women in Native communities. Yet despite this reality, use of the phrase sex work became fashionable in some well-meaning liberal circles, which assumed that term meant a show of respect for the woman when actually it signified approval for the context in which she was trying to stay alive or from which she was trying to escape. Nevertheless, after all these decades, progress has finally seemed possible. Sweden, Norway, and Iceland have passed legislation holding the customers responsible for buying human beings for sex, criminalizing the buyers, and offering the women support programs. This is now known as the Nordic model. The French Parliament voted on December 1st to follow Sweden's model with a law backed by the Minister of Women's Rights. It fines buyers for a first offense, which rises to a crime thereafter. Similar laws are pending in the parliaments of Belgium and Ireland. The European Union's women's lobby has raised the Nordic model for a vote in the European Parliament. Soon, the Nordic policy will be a misnomer. If there were justice, it would be called the Barry Dworkin model. The thing is, the model works. Since the legislation began being enforced in Sweden, prostitution has been reduced by half. So, just when you might have thought that the case was proven, the sex industry struck again. This time, the glove on its fist is a United Nations health program. You cannot make these things up. On November 4th, the United Nations Program on HIV/AIDS, that's UNAIDS, admittedly having consulted with the global network of sex worker projects, issued a policy directive asking nation-states to treat prostitution as, quote, sex work. If this initiative succeeds, it will effectively destroy the Nordic model, leaving buyers again free to purchase human beings for their pleasure with impunity. This flat-out violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is being proposed, so it's claimed, to, quote, improve health outcomes in the context of sex work, close quote. A stunning non-logic that ignores two facts. First, most Johns won't wear condoms and, criminalized or not, will not hesitate to beat up or report to a pimp any woman who insists that they do. Second, the rate of HIV/AIDS in countries using the Nordic model has already declined because the rate of prostitution encounters has declined. Can't they do the math? Not coincidentally, the rate of sex trafficking has also declined. That's no mystery. Less need to import the product. This unglues the arguments of those who treat trafficking as a separate issue, bad, from prostitution, not bad because it's sex work. Is being bought less of an enslavement if one comes from another county than from another country? What we now know is that there is one interrelated enterprise of sexual exploitation. Its tentacles connect the vast global business of pornography, the prostitution industry itself, and the local, regional, and global sex trafficking networks. We know the usual trajectory of, say, a desperate young runaway from an abusive home. A, the offer of work in films, pornography. B, the temporary turning of a trick or two, which becomes permanent deployment in prostitution. C, finding herself moved around as a trafficked commodity. But there exists a potential mechanism for addressing this lethal conglomerate. Barry, who literally wrote the book on this subject, The Prostitution of Sexuality, it's from New York University Press, also drafted a proposed UN Convention against Sexual Exploitation. It covers the above-mentioned interlocking industries and more, though as yet the UN has not acted on it. The entire convention is printed in the appendix of that book and is also accessible at the website kathleenberry.net. Abolish Prostitution Now, the website is abolishprostitutionnow.wordpress.com, is a new global campaign that includes survivors, activists, and supporters, all organizing for prostitution's abolition and for the recognition that sexual exploitation is a violation of basic human rights. This time, survivors must be heard. This time, the women's movement cannot be dismissed as just those crazy feminists, because the governments of Sweden and France, among others, are also protesting this attempt to turn the world body of the United Nations into, in essence, a pimp. Now, if only the media would consider that news. And that's it for this week. You've been listening to us on CBS Radio WJFK 1580 AM, or you've been visiting us at WMCLive.com for this and for any of our previous episodes. Be sure to find WMC Live on Facebook, Twitter, and at iTunes worldwide, where you can stream, download, and subscribe to our show's podcast anytime. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Views expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. WMC President and for this program, Executive Producer Julie Burton, Senior Producer Crystal Williams-Chancellor, and our founding sponsor, Regina Kulik-Scully. I'm Robin Morgan. Thanks for being with us. Join us next week for our special Solstice program, where we'll explore radical feminist Judaism, Christianity, and atheism with feminists from all three camps, and where I will again share, back by popular demand, my short essay, 4 Solstice Miracles, 4 Secular Saints. Only here on Women's Media Center Live.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, tune your radio to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on 1580 CBS Radio and WMCLive.com. Talk radio with a brain.